There's a special kind of loneliness that comes when the world turns its back on you all at once. That's exactly where Eleanor Hartley found herself the day her husband's family threw her out with nothing but the dress on her back and a heart full of grief. The town whispered. The neighbors looked away. She had no money, no home, and no one willing to speak her name without scorn attached to it. Then a mountain man appeared, quiet, weathered, and known more for his reputation than his words. He looked at her once and said simply, "Come with me." What happened next shocked everyone in that frontier settlement. But would their unlikely bond survive what was coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Eleanor Hartley had been a different woman entirely. She'd stood in the parlor of the neat clapboard house on Maple Street, the finest residential road in Cedar Falls, arranging white lilies in a crystal vase her mother had given her. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across the polished wooden floors. Her husband, Thomas, would be home soon from his mercantile, and she'd prepared his favorite meal, roasted chicken with herbs from her garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Life had been predictable then, comfortable. Thomas Hartley was 15 years her senior, an established merchant who'd courted her properly after her father died, leaving her alone at 23 with few prospects. Thomas had been kind in those early days, attentive in his reserved way. He'd promised her security, respectability, a place in Cedar Falls society. And for 3 years, he'd delivered on those promises. But something had changed in that final year. Thomas grew distant, distracted. He spent longer hours at the mercantile, came home with whiskey on his breath and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. When Eleanor asked what troubled him, he'd pat her hand dismissively and retreat to his study. The warmth between them cooled to polite cohabitation. She told herself all marriages went through such phases that affection would return once whatever business concerns plagued him were resolved. Then came the fever. It struck fast and merciless that October, the way sickness often did on the frontier. Thomas took to bed on a Monday, burning hot to the touch, his breath rattling in his chest. Eleanor nursed him desperately, applying cool compresses, spooning broth between his cracked lips, praying to a god she hoped was listening. By Thursday, Thomas Hartley was gone, and Eleanor was a widow at 26. The funeral was well attended. Thomas had been prominent in Cedar Falls, after all. Eleanor stood at the graveside in her black mourning dress, numb with grief and shock, accepting condolences from neighbors and business associates. She barely registered their words, their sympathetic touches. The world had taken on a strange, muted quality, as if she were moving through deep water. Thomas's brother Victor arrived from Denver the day after the funeral. Eleanor had met him only once before, at her wedding. He was a harder version of Thomas, sharper features, colder eyes, a mouth that seemed permanently set in judgment. His wife, Constance, accompanied him, a woman whose expensive dress and elaborate hat spoke of wealth and status. She looked at Eleanor's simple home with barely concealed disdain. "We need to discuss Thomas's affairs," Victor announced, settling himself in Thomas's favorite chair without invitation. He pulled a worn ledger from his leather satchel and laid it on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Eleanor's hands trembled as she poured tea, confused by the severity in his tone. "Of course, the lawyer said we'd settle the estate once. There is no estate," Victor interrupted. "Thomas died in significant debt. This ledger shows everything." He opened the book, revealing pages of figures in Thomas's handwriting. Gambling debts primarily, bad investments, money borrowed and never repaid. The words didn't make sense. Eleanor stared at the numbers swimming before her eyes. That can't be right. Thomas never gambled. He was careful with money, always telling me we needed to save. He was telling you that because he'd already spent everything, Constance said, her voice dripping false sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear, you truly didn't know, did you? The whole town knew Thomas frequented the gambling halls in Silver Creek. Everyone knew but you. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. No, Thomas wouldn't. The house is mortgaged, Victor continued, his finger tracing down the columns. The mercantile was operating at a loss. The furniture, even your personal items, they'll need to be sold to settle what's owed. As Thomas's brother and nearest male relative, it falls to me to handle these affairs. But surely there's something, Eleanor's voice cracked. The house, it was to be mine. You have no legal claim, Victor said flatly. You were married only 3 years, no children. Under territorial law, the estate passes through the male line to satisfy debts. He closed the ledger with finality. I'm sorry, Eleanor, but you'll need to vacate the premises by week's end. The next 5 days passed in a nightmare blur. Victor and Constance moved through Eleanor's home like locusts, cataloguing every possession, marking items for auction. They took her mother's china, her grandmother's quilt, even the books Thomas had given her. When Eleanor protested, Constance reminded her sweetly that everything belonged to the estate now, but the taking of her possessions was nothing compared to what came next. Somehow, and Eleanor suspected she knew exactly how word spread through Cedar Falls that Thomas's debts were Eleanor's fault. Whispers followed her down the street. She'd been extravagant, they said. She'd spent Thomas into ruin with her demands for finery. Some went further, suggesting she'd driven her husband to drink and gambling with her cold ways, her sharp tongue. One vicious rumor claimed she'd been unfaithful, that Thomas had died of a broken heart as much as fever. None of it was true. Eleanor had been a faithful, frugal wife, but truth mattered little when set against the Hartleys' influence and wealth. Victor was a successful banker in Denver. His word carried weight, and if he suggested his late brother's widow bore responsibility for Thomas's downfall, who were the townspeople to disagree? Sheriff Dalton, who'd tipped his hat to Eleanor for 3 years, now looked through her as if she were invisible. Reverend Mills, who'd praised her charity work, offered only a curt nod and vague murmurings about accepting God's will. The women who'd once invited her to sewing circles now pulled their skirts aside when she passed, as if poverty and scandal might be contagious. Eleanor found herself alone in a way she'd never imagined possible. Not just widowed, but cast out, branded with shame she didn't deserve. On her last night in the house that had been her home, Eleanor sat on the bare floor of the empty parlor, her few remaining possessions packed in a single carpet bag. Victor had allowed her to keep 2 dresses, some undergarments, and her wedding ring, though he'd examined even that with suspicious eyes, as if suspecting she might try to abscond with something valuable. "Where will you go?" Constance had asked that afternoon, her tone suggesting she didn't truly care. Eleanor had no answer. She had $17 to her name, no family, no prospects. The boarding house wanted $3 a week, and even if she could afford it temporarily, she had no way to earn more. No one in Cedar Falls would hire her now, not with the scandal attached to her name. She spent her final night in the stable behind the boarding house, curled in the hay, her carpet-bag clutched to her chest. The wedding ring on her finger, simple gold, nothing fancy seemed to mock her now. A symbol of promises broken, a life that had crumbled like ash. When dawn broke cold and grey, Eleanor walked to the creek at the edge of town and sat on the bank, watching the water flow past. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of hope. The future stretched before her, blank and terrifying. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Nothing but the clothes on her back and a grief so heavy she could barely draw breath beneath its weight. That's where she was sitting when the mountain man found her, or when she found him. Later, she'd never be quite sure which way to tell it. But in that moment, Eleanor Hartley had no idea that her real life was about to begin. The morning sun was climbing higher, though it brought no warmth to Eleanor's bones. She'd been sitting by the creek for over an hour, her mind circling the same impossible questions. Where could she go? What could she do? The $17 in her pocket wouldn't last a month, even if she could find somewhere to take her in. And beyond Cedar Falls, she knew no one, had no connections, no skills that would earn her keep in a world that had little patience for destitute widows. She became aware of footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate steps that stopped a respectful distance away. Eleanor didn't turn. Probably someone come to tell her she couldn't even sit here without permission. One more indignity to add to the pile. "You're the Hartley widow." The voice was deep, rough from disuse, but not unkind. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder and felt her breath catch. The man, standing 10 feet behind her, was like something carved from the mountain itself, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing buckskin and wool that had seen hard use. His hair was long and dark, streaked with grey, pulled back from a weathered face that spoke of years spent under open sky. A thick beard covered his jaw, but it was his eyes that held her brown and steady, with a depth that suggested he'd seen more than his share of suffering and survived it. He carried a walking stick, hand-carved and notched, with marks she couldn't decipher. A rifle was slung across his back. Everything about him spoke of a man who lived outside the boundaries of civilization. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, because there was no point denying it. "I'm Eleanor Hartley." The man nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already known. "Heard what happened? Heard how they treated you?" Eleanor turned back to the creek, embarrassed by the pity she expected to see in his face. "Then you've heard more than I care to discuss with a stranger. Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment then. "Name's Silas Drake." The name meant something. Eleanor searched her memory and found it fragments of gossip, warnings whispered by townswomen. The hermit. The mountain man. Dangerous, they said. Wild. He'd killed a man once, or maybe 3 men, depending on who was telling the story. He came to town twice a year for supplies and spoke to no one. Children dared each other to get close to him. Respectable people crossed the street to avoid him. "I know who you are," Eleanor said, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. This man had done nothing to her. "I'm sorry. That was unkind. It's honest." Silas shifted his weight, the walking stick tapping against stone. "Town talks. Most of what they say isn't true, but they talk all the same." Eleanor almost smiled at that. "I've recently learned that lesson myself." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The creek burbled over stones. A hawk cried somewhere overhead. Eleanor found herself oddly grateful for this stranger's presence, even if she didn't understand why he'd approached her. "Got a cabin up in the high country," Silas said finally. "About 8 miles north. It's simple, but it's sound. Good well, decent garden plot. More space than one person needs." Eleanor's hands tightened on the fabric of her skirt. She wasn't sure what he was suggesting, but a warning bell rang in the back of her mind. She'd heard stories about men who preyed on desperate women, who offered help with strings attached that strangled. As if reading her thoughts, Silas added, "Got a spare room. Was my wife's sewing room before she passed. It's yours if you want it. No obligations, no expectations. You can stay until you figure out what comes next, or you can stay longer. Up to you." Eleanor turned to look at him fully now, searching his face for signs of deception or ulterior motive. But his expression remained open, direct. He met her gaze without wavering, without the predatory calculation she'd learned to recognize in certain men's eyes. "Why would you offer that to someone you don't know?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because 7 years ago I was where you are now. Not the same circumstances, but the same place inside." He gestured vaguely to his chest. "Somebody showed me a kindness when I had nothing left. Didn't save me exactly, but gave me space to figure out how to save myself. Figure I can do the same. I have very little money," Eleanor said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I couldn't pay you proper rent." "Don't want your money." Silas adjusted his rifle strap. "Could use help with preserving the harvest, mending, that sort of thing, if you're inclined. But that's just sharing the work, not payment." You'd be doing me a favor, truth be told. Place has gotten away from me since Sarah died. Sarah, his wife. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. At that detail, this man understood loss, understood grief. He wasn't offering charity from a position of comfort, but extending his hand from his own hard-won survival. Before she could respond, the sound of horses drew both their attentions toward town. 3 riders were approaching at an unhurried pace. Even from a distance, Eleanor recognized the lead horse, a bay gelding that belonged to Victor Hartley. Her stomach clenched. She'd hoped to avoid Victor today, to simply slip away from Cedar Falls without further confrontation. But it seemed her former brother-in-law had other plans. Silas noticed her reaction. "Trouble? Thomas's brother," Eleanor said quietly. "He's the one who—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The humiliation was still too fresh. "I know what he did." Silas's voice had gone flat, harder. He moved to stand beside Eleanor, not touching but present, his bulk a wall between her and the approaching riders. Victor dismounted first, his expensive boots kicking up dust. He was flanked by 2 men Eleanor didn't recognize. Hired muscle, by the look of them, all shoulders and scowls. Victor's gaze swept over Eleanor with cold satisfaction before landing on Silas. "Drake," Victor said, managing to make the name sound like an insult. "Didn't expect to find you down from your hole in the rocks." Silas said nothing, just watched with those steady eyes. Victor turned his attention back to Eleanor. "I heard you were still lingering around town. That needs to stop. You've already caused enough talk, enough damage to the Hartley name. I want you gone by sundown. If you're still here tomorrow, I'll have the sheriff escort you to the county line." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame mixing with anger. "I've done nothing wrong. You're the one who cleaned up my brother's mess," Victor interrupted. "Who took responsibility for debts you helped create. Don't think you can stay here and continue to sully our family's reputation with your presence. Cedar Falls doesn't want you. No one wants you." The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. What could she say? He was right about one thing: no one in this town wanted her anymore. "She's coming with me." Silas's words dropped into the tension like stones in still water. Eleanor's head snapped toward him in surprise. Victor's expression shifted from disdain to suspicious interest. "Is that so?" Victor's smile was unpleasant. "And what makes you think you have any say in her affairs, Drake?" "She accepted my offer," Silas said evenly. It wasn't quite a lie she hadn't accepted yet, but she hadn't refused either. "She's leaving town today. That satisfy your requirements?" Victor studied Silas with narrowed eyes, clearly trying to decide if this was a problem or an opportunity. Eleanor could almost see the calculation happening behind his cold gaze. If Eleanor left with the mountain hermit, it would remove her from town and likely add another layer of scandal to her name. People would talk about the desperate widow running off with the wild man. It might even reflect poorly on her in useful ways. "Fine," Victor said finally. "Take her. But know this, Drake, if she comes back here causing trouble, making accusations, I'll hold you responsible as well." He remounted his horse, his companions following suit. "And Eleanor? Don't think distance will protect you if you decide to spread lies about my brother or my family. We have long reach and longer memories." The threat hung in the air as the 3 men rode back toward town, dust swirling in their wake. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart hammering. She'd just been bartered away like property, dismissed like garbage. The humiliation should have been complete. But somehow, with Silas standing solid and unmoved beside her, she felt something else stirring beneath the shame, a tiny spark of defiance. "I'm sorry," Silas said quietly. "Shouldn't have spoken for you like that." But he wasn't going to leave without making his point, and his point involved hurting you more than he already had. Eleanor looked up at this strange man who'd inserted himself into her disaster of a life. "You meant what you said? About the cabin?" "Every word. You don't know me." For all you know, the things they say about me might be true." Silas shook his head slowly. "Woman who'd done half what they claim wouldn't be sitting by a creek looking like the world ended. She'd be plotting her next move, working her next angle. You're not that. You're just someone who got dealt a bad hand and is trying to figure out how to keep breathing." The observation was so accurate, so simply stated, that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She'd cried enough these past weeks. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted. "I have nowhere to go." "Then come with me," Silas said, echoing the words he'd spoken earlier. He extended his hand, calloused, scarred, but steady. "Won't promise it'll be easy. Mountain living is hard work. But it's honest, and it's quiet, and nobody there cares about town gossip." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Every rule she'd ever learned about propriety screamed that this was madness. A widow didn't go off alone with a strange man, especially not one with Silas Drake's reputation. She'd be ruined completely, condemned beyond redemption. But then, wasn't she ruined already? What more did she have to lose? And something in Silas's eyes, something bone-deep and true, told her she'd be safe with him. Safer than she'd been in that town that had turned on her so completely. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, careful not to squeeze too hard. "All right," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I'll come with you." Silas nodded once, released her hand, and picked up her carpet bag from where it sat on the ground. "It's a good walk. We'll take it slow." As they started north, away from Cedar Falls and toward the mountains rising in the distance, Eleanor didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing anymore. Whatever lay ahead, uncertainty, hardship, or possibly something better, it had to be an improvement over the cruelty she was leaving behind. The morning sun warmed her shoulders. The mountain man walked beside her in companionable silence. And for the first time in months, Eleanor Hartley felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt hope. Autumn deepened into the first hints of winter. The aspens turned brilliant gold, then shed their leaves in shimmering cascades. Frost came most mornings now, painting the world silver until the sun burned it away. The air carried a sharp, clean cold that promised snow before long. Eleanor worked on Sarah's quilt in the evenings, her needle moving steadily through the fabric by lamplight. The work was meditative, each stitch a small act of creation and continuation. Silas would carve by the fire. He was making snowshoes, preparing for the deep snows that would come, and sometimes they'd talk, sometimes they'd simply exist together in comfortable silence. The silence was becoming Eleanor's favorite part. She'd spent so many years making conversation, maintaining appearances, filling every moment with the proper words and gestures expected of a merchant's wife. But here, silence meant peace rather than awkwardness. It meant two people comfortable enough with each other that words weren't always necessary. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the first real snow began to fall, Silas looked up from his carving. "You're happy here?" It wasn't quite a question, but Eleanor heard the uncertainty beneath the statement. She set down her sewing and met his eyes. "I am, more than I expected to be, more than I've been in a very long time. Even with the hard work, the isolation, especially with those things." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "In Cedar Falls, I was isolated in the middle of a crowd. Everyone watching, everyone judging, but no one truly seeing me. Here, the work is hard, but it's honest. And the isolation," she paused, searching for the right way to explain. "It doesn't feel like isolation. It feels like peace." Silas nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. Town made me feel more alone than the mountains ever did. Can I ask you something?" Eleanor picked up her sewing again, needing something to do with her hands. "Were you always solitary, or did grief make you that way?" "Little of both, I suppose." Silas ran his thumb along the edge of his carving, testing the smoothness. "I was never one for crowds or parties. Sarah used to tease me about it, said I'd rather survey an empty mountain than attend a dance, but I wasn't a hermit either. I had friends, colleagues. I could move through society well enough when needed. What changed? After Sarah died, people wanted me to grieve in a particular way. They had expectations about how long I should mourn, when I should be ready to move on, whether I should remarry. Every conversation felt like a judgment of whether I was healing properly. His hands stilled on the wood. Up here, I could grieve however I needed to, could talk to her out loud if I wanted, could break down without witnesses, could take as long as I needed to figure out how to keep breathing. 7 years later, I'm still figuring it out. Do you talk to her still, Sarah? Silas considered the question. Sometimes, not as much as I used to. Used to tell her everything what I saw that day, what I was thinking, what I missed about her. Lately, though, he stopped, seeming uncertain whether to continue. Lately, Eleanor prompted gently. Lately I've been talking to you instead. In my head, I mean when we're apart. Planning what to tell you. Thinking about how you'd react to something I saw. He looked directly at her. Doesn't mean I've forgotten, Sarah. Never will. But it means I'm not living entirely in the past anymore. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. I think that's good. I think that's healthy. What about you? Silas asked. Do you talk to Thomas? No. The answer came quickly, firmly. I know I should mourn him properly, but I'm not sure what I'm mourning. The man I married, or the man he became, or just the life I thought I had. Mostly I think I'm mourning the time I wasted not seeing the truth. That's not your fault. Maybe not, but it's my reality. Eleanor set down the quilt, the conversation too important to divide her attention. Thomas stopped loving me. If he ever truly did, I think he married me because it was expected, because I was suitable and available. And I married him because I was alone and scared, and he offered security. Neither of us were brave enough to admit we wanted more than that. What would you have wanted? If you'd been brave enough? Eleanor thought about it. Really thought about it for perhaps the first time. Partnership. Real partnership, where both people are equally invested. Where you work together towards something. That matters. Not just going through the motions of a marriage because that's what society expects. I wanted to be seen, truly seen, and valued for more than how well I managed a household or how presentable I looked at social functions. You have value beyond those things, Silas said quietly. You're intelligent, resourceful, strong. You learn quickly, and you don't complain about hardship. You see beauty in simple things, the way you admired that quilt, the way you arranged those wildflowers. You're kind without being soft, capable without being hard. Any man who couldn't see that was a fool. The words, so simply stated and clearly meant, hit Eleanor with unexpected force. When had anyone last seen her so clearly, valued her so completely? She felt tears building and blinked them back. Thank you, she managed. That means more than I can properly express. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Silas returned to his carving and Eleanor to her quilting, but the air felt different, somehow charged with possibility, with the acknowledgement that what was growing between them was more than convenience or companionship. The quilt was nearly finished now. Eleanor had matched Sarah's stitches as closely as she could, honoring the original pattern while adding her own touch to the final sections. Looking at it spread across her lap, she could almost see the two women's hands working together across time. Sarah beginning something beautiful, Eleanor completing it, both of them creating something that would last long after they were gone. It's nearly done, she said softly. Silas looked up and saw the quilt, truly saw it, perhaps for the first time since Eleanor had started working on it. His expression shifted grief and gratitude and something else mixing together. It's beautiful, he said, his voice rough. Sarah would be pleased. You honored her work. I hope so. Eleanor folded the quilt carefully. I thought we might use it in the main room on the rocking chair, if that's all right with you. It's perfect. Silas set down his carving. Eleanor, I want you to know, having you here, it's been... He struggled for words, this man who spoke so sparingly. It's been like learning to breathe properly again. Didn't realize how shallow my breaths had gotten until you arrived, and reminded me what it felt like to fill my lungs completely. Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. I feel the same way. Like I've been holding my breath for years, and finally I can let it out. The wind rattled the windows, and snow hissed against the glass. Winter was here, truly here now. They'd be snowed in soon, isolated even from the occasional trip to Hank's trading post. Just the two of them in this cabin for months, dependent on each other for survival and sanity. Eleanor should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a quiet certainty settling in her chest. This was where she belonged. With this man, in this place, building this life that bore no resemblance to what she'd planned, but felt more right than anything she'd ever known. The next morning, Eleanor finished the quilt. She tied off the final stitch, trimmed the thread, and spread it out to examine her work. The pattern was complete now, stars within stars, blue and cream, each piece connecting to create something greater than the sum of its parts. She carried it to the main room and draped it over the rocking chair, arranging it carefully. When Silas came in from his morning chores, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes going immediately to the quilt. "It's finished," Eleanor said unnecessarily. Silas crossed to the chair and ran his hand over the fabric, his touch reverent. "Thank you," he said simply, "for finishing what she started, for making something broken whole again." Eleanor suspected he wasn't just talking about the quilt. That afternoon, the snow began, in earnest, thick, heavy, flakes that transformed the world into a white cocoon. By evening, several inches had accumulated, and Silas predicted they'd be truly snowed in by morning. They prepared a good supper together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with practiced ease. As they ate, Eleanor looked across the table at this man who'd become so important to her in such a short time. "I'm glad I'm here," she said. "Glad we'll be spending the winter together. I wanted you to know that." Silas smiled a real smile, warm and genuine. "I'm glad too. Can't imagine facing another winter alone. Can't imagine this cabin without you in it anymore." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and promise. Neither of them was quite ready to name what was happening, to put words to the feelings growing deeper with each passing day. But both of them knew. Both of them felt it. Outside, the snow fell steadily, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary. Inside, the fire burned warm and the lamplight glowed soft, and two wounded people began to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant being brave enough to build a future anyway. Together, winter settled over the mountains like a benediction. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, transforming the world into endless white, broken only by the dark spires of pines. Silas and Eleanor fell into a rhythm shaped by survival and strengthened by companionship. Tending animals, managing supplies, keeping the fire burning, and filling the long evenings with conversation, handiwork, and the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. Eleanor had never been happier. The realization came to her one morning as she stood by the window, watching Silas clear a path to the barn through fresh snow. She was isolated from everything she'd once known, working harder than she'd ever worked, living in conditions Thomas would have considered primitive. And yet her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She loved him. The knowledge had been growing for weeks, but that morning it crystallized into certainty. She loved Silas Drake, his quiet strength, his careful kindness, the way he looked at her as if she mattered, the way he made her laugh with his dry observations, the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened, as if her thoughts and feelings had value beyond social pleasantness. She hadn't told him yet. The timing felt delicate. They were both still carrying grief, still navigating the complicated territory between companionship and something deeper. But Eleanor hoped he felt the same way. She saw it in his eyes sometimes, in the careful way he touched her hand when passing her something, in the way he lingered in the doorway of her room to wish her good night. They were building towards something. Eleanor could feel it like the promise of spring beneath winter snow. The stranger arrived on a grey afternoon in late January. Eleanor was inside, kneading bread dough, when she heard Silas's voice from outside, cautious, careful. Then another voice, unfamiliar. She wiped her hands and moved to the window. A man stood in the clearing, snowshoes strapped to his feet, a heavy pack on his back. He was well dressed for travel, expensive furs and quality boots. Behind him, 2 horses stamped and snorted in the cold. Eleanor's stomach clenched with sudden, inexplicable dread. Silas was speaking with the man, his posture tense in a way she'd never seen before. After a moment, he gestured toward the cabin. The stranger followed, and Eleanor quickly stepped back from the window, returning to her bread dough with trembling hands. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air. "Eleanor," Silas said, his voice carefully neutral. "We have a visitor. This is Mr. Pemberton. He's a lawyer from the territorial capital. Says he's been looking for you." Eleanor turned slowly, her hands still dusty with flour. The stranger, Mr. Pemberton, was perhaps 50, with sharp eyes and a serious expression. He removed his hat and offered a small bow. "Mrs. Hartley, I apologize for the intrusion, and I realize this is highly irregular, but I've been searching for you for nearly 6 weeks now. The matter is urgent." "Urgent?" Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I can't imagine what business you'd have with me, Mr. Pemberton. I have nothing left to claim or contest. That's precisely what I need to discuss with you." Pemberton glanced at Silas. "Is there somewhere we might speak privately?" "Anything you need to say to her, you can say in front of me," Silas said firmly. Pemberton hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Mrs. Hartley, I represent a group of creditors who had business dealings with your late husband, Thomas Hartley. In the course of investigating his estate, we've uncovered some very concerning information." Eleanor felt cold spread through her chest. "What information?" Pemberton reached into his coat and withdrew a document. "This is a marriage certificate, or rather, it purports to be a marriage certificate, dated June 14th, 1869. It bears your name and Thomas Hartley's name and the signature of one Reverend Joshua Blackwood." "Yes," Eleanor said slowly, "that's my marriage certificate. Reverend Blackwood performed the ceremony in Cedar Falls. I'm afraid Reverend Blackwood was not a reverend at all." Pemberton's expression was grave. "He was a con artist named Joshua Black, wanted in 3 territories for various frauds, including performing fake marriages to extract fees. He was never ordained by any church. He had no legal authority to perform marriages." The words didn't make sense at first. Eleanor stared at the document in Pemberton's hand, trying to process what he was saying. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you, Mrs. Hartley, that your marriage to Thomas Hartley was never legal. You were never actually married. Joshua Black disappeared 6 months after your ceremony, and investigation has confirmed he was a fraud. Your marriage certificate is worthless." The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor reached out and steadied herself against the table, her mind reeling. "But that's impossible. We lived as husband and wife for 3 years. Everyone acknowledged the marriage. Thomas's family." "His family knew," Pemberton said quietly. "Or at least, Victor Hartley knew. We have evidence suggesting he discovered the truth shortly after Thomas's death and deliberately concealed it. Why would he do that?" But even as Eleanor asked, she understood. The horror of it settled over her like ice water. Because if you were never legally married, you had no claim whatsoever to Thomas's estate, no matter what territorial law might say about widows' rights. It gave Victor complete control. He could take everything, and you couldn't contest it because you had no legal standing. Pemberton's expression softened with sympathy. What he did to you was unconscionable, Mrs. Hartley. He knew you were legally powerless, and he used that knowledge to strip you of everything and drive you from town. Eleanor couldn't breathe. 3 years of her life, fake. Her marriage, her identity as a wife, her standing in the community, all built on a lie. Thomas had never been her husband. She'd never been married at all. But Thomas didn't know. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. We don't believe so. All evidence suggests Thomas thought the marriage was legitimate. Only Victor seems to have discovered the truth, likely while going through Thomas's papers after his death. Silas moved closer to Eleanor, his presence solid and steadying. What does this mean for her now? It means several things. Pemberton retrieved more documents from his bag. First, it means Eleanor has no legal obligation to anything connected to Thomas Hartley, including the debts Victor claimed existed. Second, it means everything Victor took from her was theft, not legal estate management. And third, he paused significantly, it means she's entitled to restitution. Restitution? Eleanor's mind was struggling to keep up. My clients are Thomas's actual creditors, people and institutions he genuinely owed money to. Victor's fabricated ledger delayed their claims and allowed him to pocket assets that should have gone to settling legitimate debts. They want justice, Mrs. Hartley. They want Victor Hartley, prosecuted for fraud, and they need your testimony to make that happen. Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. You want me to testify against Victor? Yes, there will be a trial in Cedar Falls. If you testify to what Victor did, how he used the false ledger, how he took your possessions, how he spread lies about you, combined with our evidence of the fraudulent marriage certificate and his knowledge of it, we can put him in prison for a considerable time. More importantly, we can recover assets he illegally obtained. And what would I get from this? Eleanor heard the bitterness in her own voice. My reputation is destroyed. I have no possessions to recover. What's the point? The point is justice, Pemberton said firmly. And also this, he placed another document on the table. Thomas kept a separate account that Victor didn't know about, small but legitimate. If you testify and we win the case, that account would be released to you as compensation for what you suffered. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to start over somewhere. To build a real life. Eleanor stared at the papers without seeing them. Her entire existence had just been rewritten. She'd never been Thomas's wife. The shame and scandal she'd carried based on rumors about her conduct as a wife were founded on a relationship that had never legally existed. She'd been driven from town, humiliated, cast out, all because Victor Hartley had exploited a fraud to steal from her. Rage kindled in her chest, hot and purifying. When? She asked quietly. The trial is scheduled for early March. I know that's soon, and I know returning to Cedar Falls will be difficult, but Mrs. Hartley, Eleanor, you deserve to clear your name. You deserve to see Victor Hartley face consequences for what he did to you. Eleanor looked up at Silas. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the worry in his eyes. He was afraid she'd leave and not come back, afraid that going back to Cedar Falls might mean losing her. She reached out and took his hand, grounding herself in the warmth and calluses of his palm. I need to think about this, she said to Pemberton. It's a lot to process. Of course. I understand. Pemberton began gathering his papers. I've taken a room at Hank Miller's trading post. I can stay there for a few days while you consider. But I do need an answer soon. The trial date is fixed, and the prosecution needs to know if you'll testify. Silas showed Pemberton out, promising to bring Eleanor's answer within 2 days. When he returned, he found her still sitting at the table, staring at nothing. Eleanor. He knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. Talk to me. I was never married, she whispered. 3 years of my life, and I was never actually married. What does that make me, Silas? What does that make everything I thought I was? It makes you a woman who was lied to and used, Silas said fiercely. It makes you someone who survived something that should have destroyed you. It doesn't change who you are now. But who am I now? Eleanor looked at him, tears finally spilling over. I came here as a widow, but I was never a wife. I was mourning a husband who was never my husband. I was carrying shame for a marriage that never existed. You're Eleanor, Silas said simply, the woman who learned to trap rabbits and bake bread in a mountain cabin. The woman who finished Sarah's quilt and made this place feel like home again. The woman who made me remember what it felt like to want to wake up in the morning. That's who you are. The rest is just paper and lies. Eleanor gripped his hands like a lifeline. He wants me to go back, to testify, to face all of them again. I know, if I testify, they'll all see me. Victor and Constance, the people who shunned me, everyone who believed their lies. They'll all know I came back. They'll also know the truth, Silas said. They'll know Victor lied and cheated and drove an innocent woman into the wilderness with nothing. You'd be taking back your dignity, Eleanor. Taking back everything he stole from you. What if I don't want to go back? Eleanor met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. What if I just want to stay here with you and forget Cedar Falls ever existed? Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Then I'd support that decision. I'd tell Pemberton to leave and never speak of it again. But Eleanor, he reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. I don't think you can forget. I don't think you can truly move forward until you've faced this. Not for Victor or the town or justice, but for yourself. So you know you're strong enough to stand up and reclaim what's yours. He was right. Eleanor knew he was right. She could stay hidden in the mountains, safe and content with Silas. But she'd always wonder, always feel like she'd run away rather than choosing this life freely. The shame Victor had heaped on her would always lurk in the corners of her mind, unexorcised. Will you come with me? She asked quietly. If I decide to go, will you be there? Every step of the way, Silas promised. If you face this, you won't face it alone. Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling something settle in her chest, not peace exactly, but purpose. Victor Hartley had taken everything from her once. He'd used her ignorance and her grief as weapons against her. He'd counted on her being too broken, too ashamed, too powerless to fight back. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She was stronger now, forged by hardship and mountain winters. She had someone who believed in her, who saw her worth when the whole world had declared her worthless. It was time to stop running, time to stop hiding, time to stand up and show Victor Hartley and all of Cedar Falls exactly what kind of woman they'd underestimated. I'll do it, Eleanor said, her voice steady now. I'll testify. I'll go back to Cedar Falls, and I'll make sure Victor Hartley pays for what he did. Silas squeezed her hands. Then we'll do it together. Outside, the winter wind howled through the pines. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and resolve, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since the day Thomas died. She felt powerful. The next morning, Silas snowshoed down to Hank's Trading Post to deliver Eleanor's decision. He returned with Mr. Pemberton, who spent the afternoon going over Eleanor's testimony in meticulous detail. Every possession Victor had taken, every lie he'd spread, every moment of cruelty, Pemberton documented it all with careful precision. The prosecution's case is strong, he explained as dusk fell, and he prepared to return to Hank's. But your testimony is what brings it to life. You're not just evidence, Eleanor. You're the heart of this case. The jury needs to see what Victor did to a real person, needs to understand the human cost of his greed. After he left, Eleanor and Silas sat by the fire, neither speaking for a long time. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. I'm frightened, she admitted. Not of testifying, exactly, but of going back, of seeing their faces, of being that helpless woman again, even for a moment. "You're not that woman anymore," Silas said. "You're stronger now. They'll see that. Will they? Or will they just see what they want to see, the scandalous widow who ran off with the mountain man?" Silas poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Let them see whatever they want. You know the truth. I know the truth. That's what matters." But Eleanor could see the worry in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the poker just a little too tight. He was afraid too, though he'd never admit it. Afraid of what going back to civilization might mean, afraid of losing the life they'd built together, afraid that once she left the mountains, she might not return. "Silas." Eleanor waited until he looked at her. "When this is over, when the trial is done, I'm coming back here. To you. This is my home now. You're my home. Nothing that happens in Cedar Falls will change that." She saw the tension ease from his frame, saw relief flood his eyes. "You're sure? Because if you wanted to use that money Pemberton mentioned to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere more, I'm sure." Eleanor moved to sit beside him on the hearth. "I've lived in town society, Silas. I know what that world offers, and I choose this instead. I choose you." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "When you come back," he said slowly, carefully, "I'd like, that is, if you're willing, I'd want to marry you. Properly. Legally. With a real reverend and papers that actually mean something." Eleanor's breath caught. She'd known her feelings, suspected his, but hearing him say the words aloud made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. "Are you asking me?" "I am." Silas turned to face her fully. "I love you, Eleanor. Didn't think I'd ever say those words again, but here we are. You've brought this place back to life, brought me back to life. I want to build a future with you. I want to wake up next to you, for whatever years we're given. So yes, I'm asking, will you marry me?" Joy and fear mingled in Eleanor's chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you too, Silas. More than I knew I could love anyone." He cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper. 7 years of loneliness and months of growing affection pouring into that single moment of connection. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing hard, both smiling. "After the trial," Silas said. "We'll marry after the trial. Give you time to settle things, to be sure. I'm sure now. Even so, you deserve a proper courtship, not a rushed decision made in the middle of crisis." Eleanor laughed softly. "We've already done everything backwards. I moved in with you before we courted. I think we've passed the point of proper propriety. Maybe so, but I want to do this right. Want to give you the wedding you deserve, the life you deserve, all of it." They spent the rest of the evening making plans for the trial, for the journey to Cedar Falls, for the life they'd build afterward. Silas would accompany her, both for protection and support. They'd stay with Hank if he'd have them, avoiding the need for boarding house arrangements that might complicate things. After the trial, assuming she had access to that bank account Pemberton mentioned, Eleanor would use some of the money to improve the cabin, a larger kitchen, perhaps a loft for storage, proper windows for her room. But mostly they talked about smaller things, where they'd plant the garden come spring, whether they should get more chickens, the books Silas wanted to order from back east, the possibility of Eleanor teaching reading to children from surrounding homesteads, if any families moved into the area. They talked about everything except what both of them were thinking, that going back to Cedar Falls was dangerous in ways beyond social discomfort. Victor Hartley was a powerful man who'd already proven himself willing to destroy Eleanor's life. What might he do if she threatened to destroy his? The days before departure passed in a flurry of preparation. Silas made sure the cabin was secure, that the animals had enough feed, that everything was stored properly for their absence. Eleanor packed carefully, choosing her best dress for court, the one Victor had allowed her to keep, ironically, because it was too plain to be worth selling. She mended it carefully, adding small touches that improved its appearance. She might be returning to Cedar Falls under a cloud, but she'd hold her head high. Reverend Mills's wife had once told Eleanor that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you carried yourself. At the time, Eleanor had thought it the platitude of someone who'd never lost everything. Now she understood. Dignity was a choice, a decision to value yourself even when others didn't. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave, a late winter storm swept through, dumping 2 feet of snow and confining them to the cabin for 36 hours. Eleanor used the time to write out her testimony, practicing what she'd say, anticipating questions the defense might ask. Silas listened to her rehearse, offering suggestions, helping her stay focused when emotion threatened to overwhelm. "Remember," he said during one practice session, "you're not on trial. Victor is. You don't have to defend yourself or your choices. You just have to tell the truth about what he did." It was good advice, but Eleanor knew the reality would be more complicated. Defense attorneys would try to paint her as vindictive, as a woman scorned trying to take revenge. They'd bring up her current living situation, the fact that she'd been alone with Silas for months, the gossip and speculation that had followed her from town. "Let them," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Let them say whatever they want about me. Every word they speak will just prove what I've said all along, that this town was eager to believe the worst of me, based on nothing but Victor Hartley's lies." The storm cleared on the second day, leaving the world crystalline and bright. Silas and Eleanor snowshoed out to check on the animals and found everything secure. Standing in the clearing, looking back at the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, Eleanor felt a fierce surge of possessive love for this place. This was hers. This life, this man, this hard-won peace. And she'd be damned if she'd let Victor Hartley take it from her the way he'd taken everything else. The morning they were scheduled to leave arrived too quickly. Eleanor woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves. She dressed carefully, braided her hair, and tried to eat the breakfast Silas prepared. Neither of them had much appetite. Mr. Pemberton arrived as planned, his horses rested and ready. He'd arranged for Eleanor to ride one while he and Silas alternated between riding and leading the pack animal. The journey to Cedar Falls would take 2 full days of hard travel, with one night camped along the trail. As they prepared to depart, Eleanor took a last look around the cabin. The fire was banked, but not extinguished. They'd returned to warmth. Sarah's completed quilt draped the rocking chair. Eleanor's few possessions were neatly arranged in her room. Everything spoke of a life paused, not ended. "Ready?" Silas asked gently. Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure she'd ever be truly ready for this. Ready. The journey was grueling. The horses struggled through deep snow, and the cold was bitter despite the sun. They made camp the first night in a sheltered spot Silas knew, building a large fire and huddling close to it while they ate preserved meat and hardtack. Pemberton proved to be practical company, neither overly talkative nor awkwardly silent. That night, lying in her bedroll with Silas nearby, Eleanor stared up at the stars and thought about what awaited her. Victor's face twisted with rage when he realized she'd come back. Constance's shock, the townspeople's judgment, and curiosity. The courtroom, with everyone watching, everyone listening as she recounted her humiliation. "Can't sleep?" Silas's voice came soft from his own bedroll. "Too much thinking. Want to talk about it?" Eleanor considered, then said, "Tell me something good, something about after, about what we'll do when this is all over." She heard him shift, imagining him turning to face her direction. "Well, first thing, we're getting married. Proper ceremony, with Hank as witness and maybe a few folks from the area. Nothing fancy, but real. What else? We'll plant the garden together. You can teach me those techniques your mother used, the companion planting you mentioned. We'll have the best vegetables in the territory. What else?" Summer evenings on the porch. Maybe I'll teach you to play chess. Found an old set in Hank's store last time I was there. You'd be good at it, the way your mind works. What else? Years and years of this, growing old together, watching, seasons change, building a life that's ours, that nobody can take from us or diminish with lies. His voice dropped lower. That's what I see when I think about after. What do you see? Eleanor smiled in the darkness. The same thing. Exactly the same thing. They fell silent, but it was a comfortable silence now, the kind that held promises rather than worries. Eventually Eleanor drifted into fitful sleep, dreaming of gardens and mountain mornings and a future bright enough to be worth fighting for. They reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls late the following afternoon. The town looked exactly as Eleanor remembered the main street with its false front buildings, the church spire rising against the sky, the neat houses on the residential streets. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different because she was different. Hank greeted them at his trading post with warm hospitality, showing them to 2 small but clean rooms above his store. Figured you'd want separate accommodations, he said tactfully, at least for appearances during the trial. Thank you, Hank, Eleanor said, for everything. You've been kinder to me than I had any right to expect. Kindness isn't about rights, Mrs. Hartley. It's about recognizing another person's humanity. Hank smiled. Besides, I've known Victor Hartley long enough to have my own suspicions about his character. Be glad to see him get what's coming to him. That evening, Pemberton went over Eleanor's testimony one final time. The trial would begin in 2 days, giving them a day to rest and prepare. The prosecution was confident, Pemberton assured them, but nothing was certain. Victor has good lawyers, he warned. They'll try to tear apart your credibility, to make the jury doubt your motives. You need to stay calm, stay consistent, and above all, tell the truth exactly as it happened. After Pemberton left, Silas walked Eleanor to her room. They stood in the narrow hallway, neither wanting to part. I'll be right here, Silas said. Every moment of that trial, I'll be in the courtroom. You look at me if you need strength. I'll be your rock, Eleanor, however this goes. Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him softly. I know. That's the only reason I can do this. That night, alone in the unfamiliar room, Eleanor lay awake and thought about the next day. Word would spread that she was back in town. People would talk. Victor would know she'd come to testify against him. Good. Let him know. Let him spend a sleepless night wondering what she'd say, how much she'd reveal, whether his carefully constructed lies would survive the scrutiny of a court. Eleanor Hartley had been broken once. She'd been humiliated, cast out, stripped of everything but her dignity and her determination, but she'd survived, she'd healed, she'd found love and purpose in the last place anyone would have looked. And now she was back, not as a victim begging for mercy, but as a woman demanding justice. Victor Hartley had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Tomorrow the real fight would begin, and this time Eleanor was ready. The prosecution rested after Eleanor's testimony, their case laid out in damning detail. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess before the defense would present their case. Eleanor stepped outside the stuffy meeting hall, gulping fresh air, with Silas close beside her. You did well, he said quietly. Better than well. You were magnificent. Before Eleanor could respond, a figure approached from across the street, Reverend Mills, his expression troubled and uncertain. Mrs. Hartley Eleanor, he said, stopping a respectful distance away. I wonder if I might have a word. Eleanor tensed, but Silas's hand on her back steadied her. What is it, Reverend? Mills looked older than Eleanor remembered, wearier. I wanted to apologize for not standing by you when you needed support, for accepting Victor's version of events without question, for failing in my duty as a man of God to see past reputation and wealth to the truth. He met her eyes. I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. The apology, unexpected and seemingly genuine, softened something in Eleanor's chest. "Thank you for saying so, Reverend. It takes courage to admit error. Not nearly as much courage as it took you to come back here and face all of us." Mills glanced back at the meeting hall. "Many of us are seeing things clearly now. We should have seen them before. We failed you." After he walked away, several other townspeople approached, some to apologize, some simply to acknowledge Eleanor's strength, some to express shame at how easily they'd believed Victor's lies. Each interaction was brief, but collectively they represented something important, the town's conscience slowly awakening. Not everyone, of course. Eleanor saw plenty of cold stares and disapproving whispers, but enough had changed that she felt the shift from pariah to person, from condemned to complicated. When court resumed, the defense called its witnesses. Victor's lawyers tried to paint him as a devoted brother simply trying to manage a difficult estate. They brought in business associates who testified to his integrity, though none could explain the discrepancies in the financial records. They suggested that Thomas had hidden his gambling from everyone, including Victor, and that any errors in the ledger were honest mistakes. But the evidence was too strong. Every defense argument crumbled under cross-examination. The fraudulent marriage certificate was undeniable. The fabricated ledger was exposed. The testimonies of Thomas's real creditors contradicted Victor's version of events at every turn. Finally, Victor himself took the stand. His lawyer led him through a careful narrative. He'd loved his brother, had been shocked by the debts, had acted in what he believed were everyone's best interests. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances, overwhelmed by responsibility. Then came the cross-examination. Matthews approached Victor with the calm confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Mr. Hartley, when did you first learn that your brother's marriage to Eleanor was invalid?" Victor's face went carefully blank. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "It's simple. The fraudulent marriage certificate was among your brother's papers. When did you discover it was fake?" I didn't know it was fake until this investigation." Matthews held up a document. "This is a letter from the Territorial Marshal's office, dated November 3rd, 2 weeks after Thomas's death. It confirms that Joshua Black was wanted for fraud and that his marriage ceremonies were invalid. This letter was addressed to you, Mr. Hartley, at your Denver office. Did you receive it?" Victor's composure cracked. I may have received such a letter, but I didn't understand its significance. You're a banker, Mr. Hartley, a man who deals in legal documents daily. Are you telling this court you didn't understand that a letter confirming the fraud of the man who married your brother meant that marriage was invalid?" "I was grieving. I wasn't thinking clearly." "Grieving, yet clear-headed enough to produce a fraudulent ledger within days of your brother's death? Clear-headed enough to systematically strip Eleanor of every possession? Clear-headed enough to spread rumors that destroyed her reputation?" Matthews's voice grew harder. "Or were you simply calculating enough to realize that an invalid marriage meant Eleanor had no legal standing, which gave you complete control of your brother's estate?" "That's not, I didn't." "Yes or no, Mr. Hartley? Did you know the marriage was invalid when you took Eleanor's possessions?" Victor's lawyer objected, but Judge Harrison overruled him. "Answer the question, Mr. Hartley." Victor's face had gone from red to ashen. In the gallery, Constance had her hand over her mouth. The entire courtroom leaned forward, waiting. "Yes," Victor finally said, the word barely audible. "I knew." The gallery erupted. Judge Harrison's gavel rang out repeatedly, demanding order. When the noise finally subsided, Matthews continued. "So you knowingly exploited Eleanor's legal vulnerability to steal from her. It wasn't stealing. The estate belonged to Thomas's creditors, didn't it? And you delayed their claims while you liquidated assets for personal gain. How much did you pocket, Mr. Hartley? How much did Eleanor's suffering profit you?" Victor didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written across his face, in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Matthews turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense tried to recover in redirect, but the damage was done. Victor had confessed, in front of the entire town, to knowingly exploiting and destroying Eleanor. After closing arguments, the prosecution's passionate, the defense's desperate, Judge Harrison instructed the jury. They retired to deliberate, and Eleanor found herself back outside, pacing the street, while Silas watched with patient concern. "How long do you think?" she asked. "Could be hours, could be minutes. Depends on whether anyone on that jury has sympathy for Victor or just saw what we all saw, a man caught in his own web." It took less than an hour. The jury filed back in, their faces somber. The foreman stood when Judge Harrison asked for the verdict. "We find the defendant, Victor Hartley, guilty on all counts." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Then the gallery erupted again, some in approval, some in shock. Eleanor felt Silas's arm around her shoulders, steadying her as relief washed over her in waves. Judge Harrison gavelled for order. "Mr. Hartley, you have been found guilty of fraud, theft, and falsification of documents. These are serious crimes that have caused significant harm. Sentencing will be held tomorrow morning, but I can tell you now that you will serve time in the territorial prison, and you will make full restitution to Miss Hartley and to your brother's legitimate creditors." Victor sat motionless, as if carved from stone. Constance was crying openly now, her face buried in her hands. Judge Harrison turned to Eleanor. "Miss Hartley, I want to say on behalf of this court and this town that justice, though delayed, has been served. You were wronged grievously, and I hope today's verdict brings you some measure of peace." Eleanor stood, her voice clear. "Thank you, Your Honor." "It does." As the courtroom began to empty, several people approached Eleanor, Hank, Reverend Mills, even Sheriff Dalton, who mumbled an apology about not investigating Victor's claims more thoroughly. Each interaction was brief but meaningful, threads of redemption weaving through the community's conscience. But the most important moment came when Eleanor turned to Silas and saw the pride and love shining in his eyes. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Eleanor corrected. "I couldn't have faced this without you." Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and warming. Spring was coming. Eleanor could feel it in the air. The snow would melt soon, the trails would clear, and they could return to their mountain home. But first, there was one more thing Eleanor needed to do. She found Constance standing alone near the building, her face blotchy from crying. The woman looked up as Eleanor approached, fear and shame warring in her expression. "I should hate you," Eleanor said quietly. "You helped him. You spread those lies." "I know." Constance's voice was broken. "I knew it was wrong, but Victor, he convinced me that you deserved it, that you'd ruined Thomas. I believed him because it was easier than questioning him." Eleanor studied the woman who'd been so cruel to her, and found she had no anger left, just exhaustion and the desire to be done with all of it. "I hope you find the courage to choose better next time," Eleanor said. "That's all I have to say to you." She turned and walked back to Silas, leaving Constance and Cedar Falls and all of it behind. Justice had been served. Her name had been cleared. And now, finally, she could go home. 3 months later, Eleanor stood on the cabin porch and watched spring transform the mountains. Snow still clung to the highest peaks, but the clearing around the cabin had burst into life, wildflowers dotting the meadow, new grass pushing through last year's brown, and the creek running high and musical with snowmelt. She wore a new dress, simple but beautiful, made from fabric she'd purchased with some of the restitution money. The bank account Pemberton had mentioned turned out to hold nearly $1,000, not a fortune, but enough to improve their lives significantly and ensure security through the coming years. They'd used some to enlarge the cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a sleeping loft. They'd bought supplies, better tools, even a few luxuries like books and quality tea. But mostly, Eleanor had saved it, knowing that mountain life could turn harsh without warning, and that preparation was the difference between survival and disaster. Today, though, wasn't about preparation or survival. Today was about celebration. Hank Miller arrived first, riding up the trail with his characteristic punctuality. He'd closed his trading post for the day to serve as witness at their wedding. Behind him came 3 other families from the surrounding homesteads, people who'd heard about Eleanor and Silas and wanted to welcome them properly into the mountain community. And bringing up the rear, wearing his best suit and carrying his Bible, came Reverend Mills. Eleanor had been surprised when Silas suggested inviting the Reverend to perform the ceremony. But Silas had been insistent. He apologized, Silas had said. He's trying to make amends, and more importantly, he's a legitimate minister. When we marry, I want there to be no question about its validity, no doubts, no complications, no possibility of anyone ever claiming it didn't count. So Eleanor had agreed, and now here was Mills, looking nervous but determined as he dismounted and approached the porch. "Miss Hartley, Mr. Drake," he greeted them formally. "Thank you for allowing me this honor. I promise you a ceremony that's brief but meaningful, and a marriage certificate that will stand up to any scrutiny." "That's all we ask," Eleanor said, and found she meant it without bitterness. The ceremony was held in the clearing, with the mountains rising around them and the spring sun warm on their shoulders. The neighbors gathered in a loose circle while Mills opened his Bible and began to speak. "We're gathered here today to witness the joining of Eleanor Hartley and Silas Drake in marriage," he said, his voice carrying easily in the 12. "Open air. This isn't a union of convenience or propriety, but a genuine partnership born from hardship and refined by mutual respect. These 2 people have already proven they can face life's challenges together. Today, they simply make that bond official." He spoke briefly about commitment, about choosing each other daily, about building a life based on honesty and care. Nothing flowery or excessive, just simple truths that resonated in the mountain air. Then he turned to Silas. "Do you, Silas Drake, take Eleanor Hartley to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and honor for all your days?" "I do," Silas said, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Eleanor Hartley, take Silas Drake to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and honor for all your days?" Eleanor looked at this man, who'd offered her shelter when she had nothing, who'd stood beside her through the trial, who'd taught her that real love was built through daily actions rather than grand gestures. She thought about the life they'd already begun building and the years stretching ahead of them. "I do," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Then, by the authority vested in me by the territory and in the sight of God and these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife." Mills smiled. "Silas, you may kiss your bride." Silas cupped Eleanor's face gently in his calloused hands and kissed her a kiss full of promise and affection and the quiet certainty of 2 people who'd found each other against all odds. The small gathering cheered and applauded. Hank produced a fiddle from somewhere, and one of the neighbors had brought a jug of cider. What followed was a simple celebration, music and laughter, food shared among new friends, stories traded and friendships strengthened. As the afternoon wore into evening and their guests began to depart, Eleanor found herself talking with one of the neighbor women, Martha, who'd brought her 3 children. "Your stories become something of a legend." "Around these parts," Martha said with a warm smile, "the widow who survived injustice and found love in the mountains. My girls especially love hearing about it. They think you're terribly romantic and brave." Eleanor laughed softly. "I don't know about romantic. Mostly I just survived the only way I could." "That's what makes it brave," Martha said seriously. "Real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing what needs doing anyway. You did that. You came back and faced your accusers when you could have stayed hidden. That matters." After the last guest had departed and the sun was sinking toward the mountain peaks, Silas and Eleanor stood together on the porch, watching the light turn golden across the valley. "How does it feel?" Silas asked. "Being married? For real this time?" Eleanor considered the question. "Different. Better." Thomas's proposal felt like accepting inevitability. "This feels like choosing joy." Silas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I choose you too, every day for as many days as we're given." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day fade. Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, the losses and betrayals, the kindness of strangers, the slow healing of time and work and love. She thought about Thomas, buried in Cedar Falls, and hoped he'd found whatever peace awaited. She thought about Victor, serving his sentence in the territorial prison, and felt nothing but distant pity for a man who destroyed himself through greed. But mostly she thought about the present, about this moment and this man and this life they'd built together. "Tell me what you're thinking," Silas said quietly. "I'm thinking that the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm thinking that sometimes the path to where you're meant to be runs through some very dark places, and I'm thinking that I'm exactly where I belong." Silas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Me too, on all counts." As night fell over the mountains, they went inside their cabin, their home, and closed the door against the world. The fire burned warm in the hearth. Sarah's completed quilt draped the rocking chair, a bridge between past and future. Eleanor's few possessions mingled with Silas's, creating a space that belonged to both of them equally. Tomorrow would bring work, as all tomorrows did in the mountains. The garden needed planting, repairs needed making, and summer preparations couldn't wait. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for the simple joy of two people who'd found each other when both had given up hope of being found. Eleanor had come to these mountains with nothing but grief and a desperate need for shelter. She'd expected, at best, to survive, to endure until she could figure out what came next. Instead, she'd found something she never expected and hadn't dared to hope for. She'd found home, not just a place, but a person who saw her clearly and loved her completely. She'd found purpose in daily work, peace in mountain silence, and strength she never knew she possessed. Victor Hartley had tried to destroy her. The town of Cedar Falls had turned its back on her. She'd lost everything she thought defined her, and in losing everything, she'd found what actually mattered. Years later, when travelers passed through and asked about the couple living high in the mountains, Hank Miller would tell them the story. About the widow cast out by cruel in-laws, about the mountain man who offered shelter, about a trial that shook Cedar Falls, and a love that grew in the most unlikely soil. "They're still up there," he'd say, gesturing toward the peaks. "Built themselves a good life, raised a family, and proved that sometimes the best things come from the hardest times." Eleanor Drake is one of the strongest women I've ever known, and Silas, well, he finally found what he was looking for in that solitude. He found someone worth coming back from grief for. And if you traveled far enough up the mountain trail, past the trading post, and through the pine forests, you might catch a glimpse of them, an older couple working side by side in their garden, or sitting on their porch watching the sunset, or simply existing together in the peaceful quiet of a life well lived. But that was all yet to come. On this night, their wedding night, Eleanor and Silas simply held each other close and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. "Come with me," he'd said that day by the creek, offering his hand to a broken stranger. She'd taken that hand, and it had led her home. The end.